the corner. Kay Young won't drop. Draving on the rebound. Hawkins. 5 seconds remaining. It is Tucker. Ewell off the glass. And this will be a 99-87 ball game. The Iowa Cornets win it 99-87. And let's credit the Iowa Cornets for taking the measure to Miss Althea Gwynn, Al Sikorsky, and his New York Stars. And before we take a look at these statistics, let's talk with Jolene Simpson. As we have mentioned several times in the broadcast, Jolene, the co-captain of the 1976 Women's Olympic basketball team for the USA, competing in Montreal, and a veteran of AAU competition, the Pan Am Games, and you have had your taste, your first taste of professional basketball from the WBL, and let me ask you your impressions, Jolene.
Well, I'm pleased to a certain point. As I said before, I played with some of these girls and played against them, and I know what they're capable of doing. And today, many did not play or do what they were capable of doing, but I'm happy to see women's basketball develop a pro league right now, and I hope it stays, and I believe it's going to stay because the people want it to stay. Just the fact that we have, 42,000 or 4,200 people here today, it's a step in the right direction. And Milwaukee had almost 8,000 for their game. So the interest is there, and a lot of young people who are watching today now can have their aspirations and their goals to someday play women's professional league. Who knows? I might be back playing in about a month or two.
99-87 is the final score. Back for a final wrap-up on this public television station in just a moment.
Welcome to Good Seats Still Available, a curious little podcast devoted to exploring what used to be in professional sports. Here's your host, Tim Hanlon.
All right, let's get this underway, shall we? My name is indeed Tim Hanlon, and I thank, of course, our friend Corey Coates for giving me that introduction, as he has done each and every week, for God's sakes, for the last 2.5 years. I don't think he gets any royalties off of it. God forbid I even get any royalties off of this. But anyway, I still welcome you to the proceedings. It's Good Seats Still Available, our curious little podcast, our journey each and every week into what used to be in professional sports. I can't thank you enough for finding us and tolerating us yet again this week. But I think you're going to be rewarded with a very interesting and somewhat unexpected, I think, conversation with this week's guest. He is an author. And there's really not much more to that, because that is literally what our guest Stephen Provost does. He writes. He's a writer. Writer writes, as they say. Obviously, a lot of, as you can imagine, a lot of journalism experience over the years. The Fresno Bee, for example, for a good decade or so. But this is a person, as you will hear, with many eclectic tastes and interests, uniquely has written a ton about just about all of them. And I stumbled across 2 books, actually. That's where we're going to spend the majority of our time in our conversation coming up with Stephen Provost. The realm of forgotten sports seems to be something on his short list of interests. And I always am very interested in other people who share, and I think it's a smaller pool than most of our listeners, who tend to be, more interested, I guess, in a particular team or particular sport or a league, or some other sort of halcyon memory of their childhood. But it's that rare breed that goes deeper and is just generally interesting in the whole thing of defunctness when it comes to sports. Teams that sort of came and went, or went to another city, or abandoned them. Maybe the arena or the park that they played in similarly abandoned. Who knows psychologically why it's interesting to people like yours truly and a small group of others. But we're fascinated by the stories, the tales, the money in people's eyes, or the perception that this new league or new team or new whatever was going to take on the world or challenge conventions or maybe even usher in a whole new sport altogether. That's sort of the fascination that I've been interested in for years. And I think we have to harken back, actually, maybe to our second ever episode with our pal Andy Crossley, I think, to find another person who's really kind of been, similarly focused on this particular illness, shall we say. And by the way, if you haven't been to Andy Crossley's website, shame on you, because it is basically the patron saint of this show and arguably the inspiration for it. That's called funwhileitlasted.net. It's the closest thing to a living, breathing encyclopedia there is for all kinds of teams and leagues and franchises and whatnot. No longer with us. And, hopefully we'll have Andy back again to kind of just reminisce maybe about our interview now over 2 years ago. But Stephen Provost is probably the next best thing and arguably a fascinating conversation in and of itself. There are two books that stood out in my mind with Stephen that kind of piqued my interest, and I said, hey, I got to interview this guy. One of which is called A Whole Different League, which, as the name sort of hints at, the subtitle is called Outlaw Leagues, Forgotten Teams, and Other Adventures in American Sport. And it's a nice, very good and well researched and written a survey of, not comprehensively, but probably some of the more memorable and frankly a few of them less memorable leagues that sort of came and went. And yeah, there's stuff on the NASL and the World Hockey Association and, the Arena Football League and the XFL and, a bunch of things that we've talked about in various episodes, but a bunch of things that we really haven't yet or that we want to go deeper into. In particular, things like, let me just pick one out of the air here, is World Team Tennis. Obviously, we've got a bunch of leads into some conversations around that. But there's also something that he talks about, which is kind of my holy grail, actually. The deeper I've gotten into this subject, it's called the National Bowling League. And if you remember back to some of our earlier episodes when we were talking about the great Lamar Hunt, he of the AFL and the NASL, helping sort of co-found those. One of Lamar Hunt's little escapades, even before those were getting underway, and I think it was 1960, was this thing called the National Bowling League. And it was the whole concept was sort of a team-based league approach that would literally, bowl and eventually get onto television and be competitively so. And actually it wound up faltering and sort of giving way to what became more of a tour-oriented thing called the Pro Bowlers Association, which we know today. But we get into a little bit of that with Stephen. But again, his book, again, A Whole Different League, is sort of focused on sort of a whole smattering. It's a really good primer, I think, on a bunch of different leagues. And boy, oh boy, each of them have interesting stories, as proven in a book that Stephen just published about 2 months ago about one of those stories. And ironically, or maybe not ironically, it happens to feature or be featured on or focused on, there you go, a previous guest on this show. Her name was Molly Kazmer, or is Molly Kazmer, but her maiden name was Bolin, Molly Bolin. And as you all remember from that earlier episode, back a year and a half ago already, Machine Gun Molly, as she was known, was one of the standout stars of this thing called the Women's Basketball League of the late 1970s and very early 1980s. And Stephen, in the course of his research, especially about the WBL, reached out to Molly and found her story to be very interesting and recognized that hadn't really been deeply written about. Hence the book, which is called The Legend of Molly Bolin, Women's Pro Basketball Trailblazer. And indeed, of course, that is indeed what she is. And that clip that you heard at the very beginning of this show, mere minutes ago, was from one of her games. Actually, it was, I've got the details right here. Yes, December 10th, 1978, to be exact. Mike Newell on the call for the Iowa Public Broadcasting Network. And yes, that was a live game featuring the Iowa Cornets in one of their earliest of games. I think it might have been actually the second ever game played in the WBL. And Molly Bolin, of course, was part of that. So we get into that story, how he and she got connected and how the book sort of came to be. And obviously that being an outgrowth of the earlier work from last year called A Whole Different League. We get into all of that stuff. And it is fascinating, trust me, with Stephen Provost, our guest this week, coming up in mere moments. And of course, before we do that, we have to call out at least one of our great sponsors. And this week we spin the sponsorship dial and we land again on our friends, streakersports.com. And again, they are the purveyor of sports culture. They have they're really, really cool stuff, especially in T-shirts and other, sort of jersey type stuff, long sleeve shirts and baby gear, and lots of really cool things that sort of are this blend of sports, things like teams and logos and that kind of stuff, but also pop culture. And they kind of mash them up together for just a treasure trove of really fun stuff. Yeah, the Caddyshack collection, certainly interesting for sure. You like Bill Raftery as I do when the college basketball season rolls around. Well, you want that Bill Raftery Onions shirt. And if you don't know what onions is and his catchphrase, well, look it up. They've got a great collection of Bill Raftery-inspired onions wear, and they're great. And there's no better way to, hang out at a Big East game and show your love for the great Bill Raftery. But there's also, as you know by now, and if you don't, well, this is another reason to check them out at streakersports.com. Go to the Defunct Leagues section. It's in their special collections category. And yeah, they've got 4 leagues worth of great defunct T-shirts and memories and logos, all kinds of stuff. Check it out. If you're interested in the Major Indoor Lacrosse League of yore, if you're interested in the United States or Football League, or otherwise known as the USFL, they've got great shirts and stuff there. The WHA is memorialized in a special tab of offerings devoted to them. And, of course, the ABA, the American Basketball Association, all those leagues, and then a ton more other things and stuff in the realm of sports is yours to enjoy. Check them out at streakersports.com. They, again, are the purveyor of sports culture. And I noticed just now, maybe I just missed this, that's trademarked. So don't bother using that term, purveyor of sports culture, because Streaker Sports got it. But when you're on the site, of course, and when you check out all their great stuff and you find something you like, we've got a promo code for you. Use it. Use it early. Use it often. And that promo code, of course, is Good Seats. Yep. What a shock, huh? Good Seats. That's the promo code at streakersports.com. 10% off all your purchases using that promo code Good Seats. We love Streaker Sports. We hope you do too. And we thank them for their sponsorship. Of course, we hope, of course, too, and additionally, that you will enjoy this conversation that we had just a couple of weeks ago with author extraordinaire. His name is Stephen Provost, and here's our conversation coming up. Give our audience a sense of sort of how this sort of topic entranced you and got you interested enough to write a book or two on teams and leagues no longer around.
Well, I've always been interested in things that people might have forgotten, if not for being reminded of them. And I've always been a sports fan. I started out as a journalist at a small daily as a sports editor, and worked as a sports editor for on and off for about 10 years, and then went on to work in news. But I always had that interest in sports. When I was young, my dad gave me a book called The Great American Sports Book by George Geip, and it went into a number of obscure stories about people like John L. Sullivan from boxing, and I just got mesmerized by the idea of all these people who had Jack Johnson and Tommy Burns, who had held the heavyweight championship back in the day. But it also talked about things like bowling and cycling and sports that don't show up in the sports pages that often. And I found that really interesting too. And so this book had always been a whole different league, had always been a book that I thought I would be interested in writing, but I hadn't gotten around to it. I've written about 20 books now, and I just did it in my spare time because it was a passion. It was my own interest. And I thought I had the idea of putting together something like what George Geip did, except for focusing on leagues and teams that were defunct. And so I came up with 22 or 23 different leagues that are spotlighted in this book, and wanted to put together some kind of a compendium. I know people have written books about these leagues, and entire books about many of these leagues, but I wanted to have something of a one-stop shop of interesting little tidbits and stories woven into an overview about each of these leagues.
Yeah, that's interesting because when I started this little show 2 years ago or so, it had been an idea similar, rattling around in my head for years. And I've been in the advertising and media and way early on in my collegiate and just after college years in the journalism space. And it was always sort of this extra idea, but it always seemed to keep building, right? There was always another log or another piece of wood that you could proverbially throw on the pile. Because there was always a league or a team or whatever that was either relocating or going bust, and it just seemed like it was a completely, regenerating topic, and it just kept gnawing at me to the point where, I don't know if I'm ever going to have the time or the wherewithal or frankly the discipline to do. I was thinking more of call it an encyclopedia, right? Where you'd have listings of all the teams. But then once you start getting into the research and you start scratching the surface, if you will, or beyond the surface, You just get the rabbit holes, right? I mean, just multiple rabbit holes of teams and teams that might have been and conjecture as to whether there was actually a franchise or it was just talked about, or you get lost and you get to write one single word because you're just so caught up in all the research.
It's very interesting to do the research, and whether I'm researching this kind of book, I've also written books about old highways and my hometown. I've always looked for little nuggets that people might have forgotten about the past. And when I was growing up, I remember I was listening to one of your podcasts, and you, I think, mentioned the North American Soccer League and going to these games and finding and wondering whatever happened to these teams because they were constantly changing. And I had a similar fascination. I went to a Los Angeles Aztecs game back in 1976 or something like that, and I think there were 9,000 people in the Rose Bowl, which holds 100,000 people, and thought, well, this is just interesting. And I'm not a big soccer fan, but I just found the idea of this league trying to make it in North America at a time when soccer was really not very popular. It's more popular now, but it's at that time it was basically Pele and everything else. And Pele, everyone knew who Pele was, but beyond that, it wasn't that popular. So I also grew up watching the World Football League and rooted hard for that to make it. Watched the USFL and in the 1980s and rooted hard for that to make it, and it didn't make it. And most recently watched the AAF, the Alliance, fold, which was frustrating to me because I thought that was a great idea. And I think spring football in general is a great idea. But you're right, it goes down a rabbit hole, and there are all these different leagues that you could, each one of these leagues that's mentioned in this book could be a book of its own and has been a book of its own. But I wanted to condense it a little bit. And so if you're more interested in learning about this, of course you have in the back my list of references, which is pretty extensive. And you can go to these other books that tell the whole story of, say, the National Bowling League or the Continental Football League, which was actually where this thing started for me, which is kind of interesting. I know I'm rattling on a little bit, but let me tell you this one quick thing.
That's great. I do want to hear the origin story. So why the Continental Football League, which arguably was, a semi-pro kind of outfit that, I don't know, wanted to be a competitor or not to the NFL? We haven't talked about it, but
it did. It initially started out with, I think it was Happy Chandler was the first commissioner of this league in 1965, and it had teams in 10 different cities, some of which were large, like Toronto and Philadelphia, and others of which were like Wheeling, West Virginia, and Charleston, West Virginia, which are little outlier towns, kind of like Green Bay is in the NFL. And I had this book that I opened up, and it had a map of where teams were, where the major professional football teams were in 1966. And I don't know where I got this book or how it fell into my lap, but it had a map that plotted each of the NFL teams, each of the AFL teams, but then it also had each of these Continental Football League teams. And I thought, I've never heard of that thing. What is that? And so this was way back 30 years ago, 40 years ago, something like that. And I thought, I've got to look this up and see what it's about. And I found out that it was this league that was trying to be a major league for the first couple of seasons, and then decided it wanted to be a feeder league for the NFL, but the NFL didn't really want a feeder league, and especially when the end came when the NFL and AFL merged in 1970, because they had some agreements with some of these teams in the Continental Football League to be a kind of a developmental league at that point. And Pete Rozelle decided he didn't want to have any of those kind of agreements in place once the two AFL and NFL had merged. So they decided not to do that, and as a result, the Continental Football League just kind of disintegrated after that. But they had teams at some point in places like Orange County, California, and a team in Mexico City for like 3 or 4 games, a team in Akron, Ohio, whose owner was, I guess, a kind of a scoundrel and a con artist who made off with a bunch of money, and he hired Doak Walker, the legendary player, as his coach, and never paid him. And so that team went defunct after 3 years. So there are 3 games. So there are all these different stories, and each of these leagues has stories like that, as I'm sure you know, because you've been been going through some of this, and your podcast seems very similar to what I was working on with this book.
Well, yeah, we also our second ever guest was our pal Andy Crossley up in New England in the Boston area, who's been sort of toiling at it for years with his little website called Fun While It Lasted. Which emanated out of largely he having been in a previous career sort of in the minor leagues and then for a little bit in women's professional soccer as well, but also almost as an adjunct to various memorabilia that he collected, and it was just sort of an adjunct of an eBay store and that kind of stuff. And hey, why not write some stories around these things as I have them, and then ultimately sell them or buy them and trade them and that kind of stuff. And you're right. I do. It's also very interesting too, because it's not just, what I found originally, 2 years back was that, I think it's usually something along the lines of people may have a particular memory or two about a particular team and then by extension league that's probably close to some layer of their childhood years. And there's a memory attached to that. If it's, the first ever game, or going to a game with one of your parents or as a family, or just other things that, as you take in life in a much more, shall we say, non-cynical way when you're young. And then, as you get older and life sort of takes you on its various courses, you kind of waft back occasionally, or maybe regularly, to some of those moments, including those teams. And then all of a sudden, something happens. Maybe it's an anniversary of the team, or a team moves, and or there's a reporter that harkens back to the 35-year anniversary of X or Y. And then all those memories keep flooding back. And then when you start scratching into those, the stories, to your point, right, start flowing out, and some very interesting themes. And I'll sort of toss this as a softball to you. As you start to go through this exercise and whittling down the teams and leagues, were there any themes that kind of popped up that you kind of saw repeating themselves or regenerating? Because I've certainly seen some of that in my exploration the last couple of years.
Well, one of the themes that I see is the reserve clause, and how many of these teams were fighting against the reserve clause, which allowed teams in Major League Baseball, for example, to before the advent of free agency, to perpetually keep players on their rosters without the players really consenting to do so. And so many of these leagues came about as one of their strategies was to say, hey, we're going to try to lure players to our league because we won't have a reserve clause and they'll be able to become free agents. And that was a powerful tool that they had to use because, and the established leagues were scared of this, but the established leagues also had all the name recognition and the money and the established wherewithal to fight it. And so these teams, it just again and again and again, these leagues that would start up would end up folding after a year or two because they didn't have the money. Even the ones that were fairly well off to start out with, they had a good business plan, they had a powerful or moneyed owners, and they were able to lure some good players. The Federal League in 1915 would be one that started out on very good footing and seemed to have a good shot at becoming a lasting third major league, but it ended up folding. The USFL had a great business plan. We all know what happened with that. I won't go into that because it becomes political. But again and again, the theme that I see is that these leagues just don't work for one reason or another. But and more recently, there have been fewer and fewer of them because the established leagues have become more and more powerful. The reserve clause is largely gone because you have free agency now. So the leagues that would challenge the established leagues don't have that as a card to play to lure players to their leagues anymore. And there is so much money in the NFL and the NBA and Major League Baseball that there just is not enough capital and enough staying power for any league to really challenge these monolithic, almost monopolistic major leagues.
Yeah, there's the word. But ironically, and another sort of take on it is that it only makes them more alluring for people on the outside who want to get in, and for whatever reasons can't get in or are rebuffed. There's a theme we've seen in a lot of cases. The AFL, for example, the fourth version of such, Lamar Hunt, et cetera. Just saying, look, we'll show you, and it just doesn't, frankly, seem to stop, right? And to me, the history lessons, there are some very strong themes. I mean, you mentioned the reserve clause. I think there's also an element of big boys and their toys. There's the sort of trophy sort of hunting, if you will, and not being part of the club and having quote unquote made it. Arguably, Donald Trump not getting into the NFL. Steve Ross. Buying the Cosmos, right, was ultimately a rebuff from the NFL as well. These themes sort of keep coming on and on, but for whatever reason, and to me, this is the funny part. I don't fancy myself an historian by trade, but there is that sort of proverb of, those who ignore history are doomed to repeat it. I too was rooting for the AAF. We just did a conversation with Sports Illustrated's Connor Orr, which we're going to be dropping next week, who's written some really, really good in-depth articles, just not even a month or two after the demise of that league. But, you look at that one, it's like people literally thought that they had this one figured out, right? I mean, from an investment perspective, from a technology perspective, from all these kinds of things. And yet still, right, it's maddening to me, and it's endlessly fascinating to me.
Right. Another example, the Boys and Their Toys Club comes to mind is Abe Saperstein, the Globetrotters owner who started the ABL back in 1960. And people forget that was the first league that had the three-point play. But he felt like he wanted a team in Los Angeles in the NBA, and the NBA was kind of saying, no, we're not going to allow you in. So he started thinking, well, we're going to have a league of our own, so to speak. And he was also frustrated with what he felt like was too many points being scored in the NBA. So he felt like he wanted a league that there would be more emphasis on defense. And the irony of that is that that's a league that started the three-point play, which today has caused an explosion of scoring in the NBA to the point where we've got more scoring this year in that league than we ever have before.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people, sort of look at the ABA as kind of the originator of that, and obviously the history tells us otherwise, right? So, all right, so you got these leagues and teams and this idea sort of rattling in your head, and for a long time. How do you go about process-wise? You're a writer by trade, right, in various other topics. How do you go about sort of sifting, sanding, prioritizing, and then going to work on actually putting the pieces together without going down rabbit holes?
I'm kind of a pantser, which is a term that authors often use, the seat of their pants type approach. I had an idea to do this, so I thought, well, I'll devote roughly 5,000 to 8,000 words to each of these leagues, and a few of them are less than that, and a few are a little bit more. But I'll devote about that amount, and I'll just start researching, and I'll see what I can find. And I thought, well, that's interesting, I'll write that, and that's interesting, I'll write that. And I have all these. Being online is great because you have all these at your fingertips resources that you don't have to go to the library. You can go to newspapers.com and find all these old clips and research those. And one thing leads to another. So it is kind of a rabbit hole thing. There is the sense that you see something and you want to find out more about it. So you go to the original clips in newspapers.com or old Sports Illustrated issues that you find online, and you find out more about that. And then you weave it all together into a coherent little story. And so that's what I did. It's not, I've always been really good, I guess, at taking puzzle pieces and putting them together. And so that's what this is. I didn't know how many leagues I was going to attack or going to address when I started this out. I started out with the Continental Football League, and then I decided, well, World Football League. And the National Bowling League was one that I started because they had a team in Fresno, California, which is my hometown. And so that had always fascinated me because Fresno had never had a major league team in any sport except for the National Bowling League. So I thought, well, I'm going to use that as one of my devote a chapter to that. And some of them were rather obvious. The All-American Football Conference, the World Football League, the USFL, and others were less so. I even have a chapter about roller derby, which obviously for much of its existence was not competitive at all, but I still found it fascinating. And I thought, well, this is my book. I'm going to put in a chapter about roller derby. And it just, the last chapter that I came up with, because you're always thinking, well, what is there anything I'm missing here? And I'm sure I did miss some things. But I came across the Women's Pro Basketball League of the 1970s, which I had totally forgotten about. And I thought, oh, I've got to include that because that's kind of a seminal league for that sport, kind of like the American Girls Pro Softball League or Pro Baseball League. And I thought, well, this is kind of analogous to that, so I've got to include that. And so that was the last one that was included in the book, and I just put them together in different sections. I have a football section, a baseball section, a basketball section, and then an other sports section that goes from everything from bowling to hockey to softball to baseball, or not baseball, but bowling and roller derby and world team tennis. And so that's kind of how it's organized.
So going into this, like which leagues did you kind of thought you knew about and frankly really didn't by the time you got out of all of it? And which ones did you discover maybe that you didn't even know about going into all this? It sounds like the National Bowling League might have been one. And that's one that sort of fascinated me. And there's so little written about it. And my understanding, if I'm not mistaken, I think Lamar Hunt, the godfather of the American Football League and North American Soccer League for that matter, I think he actually was part of that mix, right, with the Dallas franchise down there in Texas?
Yeah, he built something called the Bronco Bowl, which was this huge stadium, and they did the same thing in Fresno. They built a stadium specifically for this, but in Texas, Lamar Hunt built this Bronco Bowl that had 72 lanes, and it was set up for television and a big production. And so, yeah, that's one of the interesting things that I found about this is there was this 1 or 2 years, 1960-61, where all these leagues came into being, or almost came into being. You had the AFL, you had the National Bowling League, you had the ABL, American Basketball League, the Continental Baseball League, which ultimately didn't come into being, but is addressed in this book because I found it interesting that this third baseball league almost came about in 1960. And so you have all these different leagues coming into being at that time. And Lamar Hunt was involved in at least a couple of them, and Abe Saperstein was involved in a couple of different leagues throughout his career. And so to answer your question, the leagues that I had a knowledge of each of these leagues. But whenever I'm writing a book, part of the fun of it to me is to find things out about different things, about what I'm researching that I didn't know. So it's kind of a selfish endeavor because if I knew everything going in, I'd just be regurgitating things that I knew, and that would be kind of boring. The discovery, the scavenger hunt for me in writing historical nonfiction is what gets me into it, and finding out things about, like, for example, the World Football League. There was this quarterback who played for the Philadelphia Bell named King Corcoran. And it always fascinated me that this guy, his name was King. It's like, what was he? What was so cool about this guy? He never played in the NFL, or actually I found out subsequently that he played very briefly in the AFL. But what was so great about this guy? And so I started looking him up, and it turns out that this guy was the poor man's Joe Namath. He was this really flamboyant character who put up ridiculous numbers of touchdowns and yardage and also interceptions in the World Football League for a season and a half, and that was basically his claim to fame. So you get these hooks, and you know a little bit about something going in, and you think, I want to find out a little bit more about that. And that's one example. Another example of a guy I didn't know anything about was a guy named, I believe his first name was John Brisker in the ABA, who was this really high-scoring player for the Pittsburgh Condors. Ended up going into the NBA, but he was like he had a bad attitude, so he'd always want to fight people on the court. And one coach said, the minute you go out there on the court when they're going to have the tip-off, just cold cock the guy. And so he did, just because he wanted to get in his head. And another team had this night where they invited all these boxers, like professional boxers from the past. And I can't remember who they were, but they were like 4 or 5 of them. I think one of them was Ron Lyle, who was actually still active at that time. But and they said, we're going to have these people at courtside. So when this John Brisker guy comes in, he's not going to cause any trouble, because if he does, these folks at courtside are going to take care of him. Well, of course, he didn't cause any trouble. But what's even more fascinating about this is this Brisker guy was a really good player. He scored like 25 points a game a couple of seasons, ended up with the Seattle Supersonics, and didn't get along with Bill Russell, who was coaching the team at the time, so he didn't get much playing time. And he finally made a couple of bad investments, I think, in a bar or a restaurant, and lost his money, lost his pro basketball career, and ended up flying away to Africa. And was never heard from again. And they think that he may have been killed by Idi Amin's henchmen or something like that, but they don't know, because he just was never heard from again.
See, now I don't, with those kinds of stories, right? I can't imagine how you don't sort of stop and go deeper and then try to build those further out, or perhaps you have a stack of story ideas that did come out of all this that maybe is sitting there waiting for renewed attention. No?
I don't think so.
Nothing stood out to you that said, I want to come back to this one because there's so many layers and or intrigue here that my survey just can't do it justice?
Well, one thing did, and that's the book that I wrote subsequently, the Legend of Molly Bolin. That did stand out to me, and that was something a little bit different. I had always wanted to write a biography and had never gotten around to it, and I'd never connected with anyone who was interested in doing it. And so by chance, I reached out to her. Her name's Molly Kazmer. She's living in California now, but she was this. Her story stood out to me because I had never heard of her. And if you hear about the Women's Professional Basketball League in 78 to 81, you've heard about Nancy Lieberman, and you've heard about Carol Wojciechowski, and you've heard about Ann Myers, certainly. But this player scored more points than any of those people. And I'd never heard of her. And I thought, that's just really weird. Now, why I never heard of this person? And so I reached out to her. She happened to be online, and I just kind of as a lark, I thought, well, maybe she'd be interested in commenting for this book. And lo and behold, she did. She was interested in it. And I know you've interviewed her in the past, and so you know how interesting her story is. And so that story was one I eventually said, has anyone ever considered writing your biography or working with you on a biography? And she said, well, as a matter of fact, that's something I've been kicking around for a while, but I haven't gotten around to it. And I thought, there's something. The more I heard about the old Iowa 6-on-6 basketball and what she had accomplished in her career, and some of the things that she'd been through were just fascinating, that I thought this would make a whole book. And so I proposed the idea of working together with her, and we did. Over the next 2 months, after I finished A Whole Different League, I worked with her intensively over the next 2 months, and came up with the Legend of Molly Bolin, which is her biography. And I'm very pleased with how that turned out as well. So that's the project that came out of A Whole Different League that I was not prepared at all. I was actually writing A Whole Different League to get this out of my system, because it had been building up in me for the last 30, 40 years, that I just wanted to get this out and have this be my sports book. And lo and behold, I got in touch with Molly, and now I have 2 sports books. And I'm certainly open to writing others, because sports has always been a love of mine, and continues to be to this day.
Yeah, so for those listeners who have not enjoyed our tremendous conversation with Molly, that's our episode number 28. It's clear that she was a pioneer, as was that league, as you subtitle it in your book, ahead of its time, without which, subsequent leagues and certainly now the WNBA would not exist. But yeah, I mean, Molly was she was a superstar in Iowa. I mean, she signed her contract right in the office of the governors, and it was like a television event locally as well. I mean, it was quite something, and she was also not too difficult to. Let's put it this way: she wasn't unattractive either, which certainly helped a lot on the publicity side as well for the casual fan. And it was just a very interesting story. Yet, but I thought for sure that you would go back. You had mentioned 1960 and 1961, right? I think there's another, era too, right? Which I'm sure you've sort of discovered is the 1970s, which was its own sort of wellspring of. Now we have a couple of conversations in the can that we're editing now, and we want to get a few more to sort of wrap them up with. One of the key progenitors of all that, and his name is Dennis Murphy. This is a guy who was, either directly or indirectly involved with the ABA, the WHA, the World Football League, a bit of World Team Tennis, Roller Hockey International. I mean, people like Gary Davidson, who was also part of the sort of the mafia, if you will, that not true mafia, but of sports, shall we say, agitators and progenitors to create new and challenging leagues. Some of which, for some of the reasons you mentioned earlier. That to me is just, and I, as a child of the 70s, speaking for myself, right? I mean, that's this North American Soccer League. I mean, those are the things that came across my radar, and that thus, to me, almost feels like it's a natural thing to have all these sort of leagues and challengers to the convention emanate from that, and it just doesn't seem to stop.
Yeah, that's one of the things you ask about my motivation. The other thing is, as many sports fans are, I love rooting for the underdog. And these leagues are all underdogs, so I was always rooting for every one of them. The 70s, you're right. Dennis Murphy evidently had started out wanting to put together to have an NFL football team, and through those meetings ended up in helping to create the ABA and getting George Mikan involved, and George Mikan coming up with the tricolored basketball that they used in the ABA. And so a lot of that's really interesting. And Gary Davidson was involved in all these different leagues as well. The ABA, kind of the triumvirate of the three leagues, the ABA, WHA, and WFL. These people all seem to be involved in each one of them. The other thing I found really interesting was that they were, and I didn't know this before, was that they were thinking of the guy who was behind the USFL, whose name escapes me at the moment, but he was trying to get an NFL team in New Orleans. This was like in 1965 and hadn't been able to do so. And of course, the NFL did eventually expand into New Orleans a year later, but in part because of this guy's push. But his idea was, since you're not giving me a team in New Orleans, I'm going to start a new league, and I'm going to make it a spring league, and it's going to be called the USFL. This was back in 1965, and he dropped the idea when he was able to get the team, and he was a part owner of the team, of the New Orleans Saints in the NFL. But this idea kind of germinated in his mind for the next 14 years, and lo and behold, it came out in the early 80s with the USFL, same name, same concept, but the germ of success was there because cable was just coming about, and so you had this new outlet for televised football. And so the time was right for the USFL then, when it hadn't been in the early or the mid-'60s. But then the mid-'60s, right after that, you had, again, the Davidson-Murphy leagues, as you might want to call them, because these two guys were involved in each one of them. It seemed that they're almost like hopping from one to the other.
Yeah, and David Dixon is the guy you're thinking about from '68, who he was enamored with this idea of spring football. And again, so there's another idea, another theme, right? So, the AAF, its demise, there are various reasons still yet to sort of fully unfold. And obviously we're going to be, focused on that topic for many, many months to come. But, here comes, the ultimate brash statement, right, is the reboot of the XFL. I mean, here comes Vince McMahon again, not having learned any lessons from 2001, it seems, or maybe perhaps he has.
You never know. I thought the Alliance of American Football would make a go of it. I thought it would certainly last the season because I thought they had a decent business plan. I thought they weren't overpaying their players. And they had this tie into sports betting, which evidently was working pretty well. But even with their budget, they weren't able to make it work because they weren't getting that many people in the stands. I don't know if you saw, you probably did see some of the games in, for example, Salt Lake City, where there was virtually nobody there. And I would love to see spring football work. I think I'm a football fan, and even though I love watching the NBA as well, I'm not as big an early season baseball fan. And so that period of time, having a football league to fill some of the void for me personally is a great idea, but it just hasn't caught on yet. I don't know whether the XFL will work or not. And he's saying it's going to be very different than the first XFL, but those games, to be honest, were god-awful boring. I mean, I tried to watch the XFL, and from my personal point of view, it was the least interesting football league as far as the quality of football that I've seen. And so it's got to be better than that.
All right, a brief pause in the proceedings just for a second to pay a couple of bills, and we appreciate your giving our sponsors some consideration as always. And one of our earliest ones that continues to be with us and we love is our friends at Audible. And Audible is, as you know, the king of audiobooks. And if you've never tried an audiobook for yourself, well, here's a great opportunity to do so and to support the show at the same time. And that's when you go to audibletrial.com/goodseats. That's the place to go, and you're going to get a free audiobook download for yourself to try for free, gratis, on us. You can cancel the Audible service at any time, and once you do download that book, and if you do decide to cancel it, it's yours to keep. So that's our little free gift, and even if you don't continue with the Audible service going forward, you'll at least get a free audiobook out of the deal. And look, if you consider yourself somebody who's interested in sports and sports history and that kind of stuff, like we try to pursue on this little podcast, you're going to find a whole bunch of titles in the vast array of, 190,000 and counting titles to choose from. And in particular, if you like the hoops, the basketball, well, sure, we got a couple of those books, including, of course, probably the quintessential tome, oral history, if you will, of the ABA, the American Basketball Association. That's called Loose Balls, and Terry Pluto is the writer and I believe the narrator of that book as well. That you could use your credit for that, and it's a wonderful romp, that book, and a great oral history of perhaps the most colorful basketball league of all time, the ABA. Or if you're really interested, let's say, in the National Basketball Association's history, you could check out the audiobook from our previous guest, David Surdam, who we had a great chat about the history of the NFL. But this book is called The Rise of the National Basketball Association, and David wrote it. It's narrated by Todd Bars-Ness. You say that 3 times fast. And a lot of the interesting stuff in this book talks about the NBA in the context of congressional hearings around antitrust and that kind of stuff around the 40s and 1950s. Fascinating stuff. And you could use your credit for that book too, among, like I said, 190,000+ other titles to choose from at Audible. And again, it's audibletrial.com/goodseats. And you're going to get, again, your free audiobook download courtesy of us. You can cancel at any time. It is yours to keep, and we appreciate you giving them a try, and we certainly appreciate you rejoining our conversation right now. The audacity, right, of Vince McMahon. I mean, he's going to the big stadiums. He's got a big television contracts and stuff. I mean, he's spring football in some cold weather cities. that didn't all go very well in other leagues too. And the track record of success, with the exception of the AFL, which was probably the standout success, and to a lesser extent the AAFC, which wasn't really a merger but more of a sort of a cherry-picked handful of teams, there's not a lot of success behind the scenes here that bodes well for. Certainly the AAF, had its work cut out for it should it have survived. But, the XFL too, I don't know. I mean, call me a cynic.
I'm kind of scratching my head about that decision. Putting a team in Washington, when has an alternative team in Washington ever worked? You had a relatively strong USFL league, and it didn't work there. The Washington Federals never drew anything, and were out of there, I think, by the second season. So I question the audacity in terms of business acumen there, but who knows? I wish them well, but I think going to the smaller markets makes more sense to me because those markets are more hungry for football. You've got the NFL in every market. I think that the XFL is planning, except for St. Louis. And are they really going to be that interested in spring football? And again, this is at a time when the NFL season has just concluded. I wonder about starting the season right after the Super Bowl, which is what the AAF did as well. But would it be more reasonable to start it closer when, like, the WFL had started its season, which was in the summer, and I think it was in July, or maybe in May or June, when people are, I don't know. It's all speculation, and it's all on the table until it happens. But as we talked about, these leagues just don't seem to succeed whatever they try often. I
think the interesting thing now, though, is we're in an era where television, is arguably more important than ever when it comes to sports. And having been in the media and advertising industry for much of my latter part of my professional career, it's very interesting to see how dependent especially broadcast television is on specifically the NFL, but sports generally. And you even have the new Fox, right? Having shed its studios to Disney and whatnot, is fancying itself as sort of a live antidote, if you will, to the streaming and on-demand world of the Netflixes and the Hulus of the world, where else are you going to see live and relevant content, that will attract people? News is one, and sports is the other. And we talk about some of these sort of lesser leagues or challengers and all that kind of stuff, but the beast needs to be fed, and there's plenty of inventory, shall we say, or availability for leagues like the XFL, for example, or the AAF for that matter, to pay for distribution, right? To rent, if you will, some time, build up some audience, and then maybe get paid for rights down the road once they achieve some level of interest. But I guess my thought is that, with the explosion of television and now digital video and mobile video, it almost seems to me that that's almost maybe the first thing that comes to mind when people are putting these leagues together versus, attendance, ticket sales, at-game experience, right? It's really about almost programming and relatively inexpensive programming for the TV networks that are desperate to get more audiences.
Right, and you have so many cable networks out there that have programming blocks to fill that I don't think there'll be a problem getting these leagues a television contract, whether it be with the NFL Network or TNT or any one of a number of different outlets. I think the problem is similar to what I see in my industry as an author, is saturation. You have so many choices out there that even if there's a place for these leagues to have a presence, a television presence, will people know about it, or will they want to watch Game of Thrones instead, or this Stranger Things, or something like that? It's the same argument that's been made in Los Angeles, that Los Angeles would be a great sports city if there weren't so many other options. And there's this graveyard of teams that have tried to and failed to make a go of it in LA, because people would rather be at the beach or at the movies or are doing something else. And I see that as the impediment to making a league work. Even though there certainly is an outlet for it, there are programmers who will say, hey, yeah, come over onto our station and we'll give you a block of time, 3-hour block of time or whatever. But how many people will watch it, and how lucrative will it be? May give you a block of time, but people may not know it's on. I thought the AAF did a great job of promoting itself, but most leagues won't have the wherewithal to do even that. And even if it's on, the television contract isn't going to be something like Monday Night Football used to be for ABC when it was on ABC or ESPN now. But it's not going to be something like that where the league is going to get a huge revenue chunk from this, because it'll be on TBS or something even more obscure than that.
In your survey of all the leagues in your book, were there any specific teams or situations that popped out as being beyond extraordinary, on their own, that was were especially memorable for you, or that you thought you knew, or maybe you just didn't know until you got into it?
Well, I thought the story of Jackie Robinson was really interesting because he was more of a football prospect than he was a baseball prospect, and he actually played in the Pacific Coast Football League against Kenny Washington, who was his teammate at UCLA and who ended up being the first black or one of three, I think, 2 or 3 first black football players in the NFL in 1946. And, of course, Jackie Robinson broke in with the Dodgers the year after that. And so I thought that was really interesting, that they played games against each other, like 2 or 3 games against each other. One played for Los Angeles, the LA Bulldogs, and the other played for the Hollywood Bears back in the Pacific Coast Football League back in the early 40s. I've always thought that the story of Benny Kauff, the Ty Cobb of the Feds, was really interesting, because here's this guy who came in and was this fantastic baseball player for 2 years in the Federal League, won 2 batting championships, hit in the high 300s, mid to high 300s a couple of times, and was this phenomenon. And then he did okay when the Federal League folded and he ended up going to the majors. But what I didn't know about that was he was actually kicked out of the league by Kennesaw Mountain Landis on a charge that had to do with nothing with baseball, but had to do with, I think, him selling a car that was supposedly hot. And the whole case went to court, and it turned out that he was exonerated. He was acquitted, and it didn't matter because he had insulted Kennesaw Mountain Landis, who said, I'm not going to let you back into baseball. And so he was out of baseball after 6 or 7 years. I thought that was a really interesting story that I didn't know that aspect of it going in. Are
there any leagues that you surveyed that you were surprised that didn't, wind up making it, and or if not for a particular event or situation, perhaps maybe could have continued and made it to the promised land, so to speak?
I thought that I always thought the ABA had a good shot at making it. They just didn't have the franchise stability, I don't think, to make it. And of course, the 4 teams did end up joining the NBA. What I thought was interesting about that was there was a 5th team, the Kentucky Colonels, which was very successful at the gate and was pretty successful on the court as well, but didn't make it. And I always wondered why the Kentucky Colonels didn't join the NBA, because they seemed like a good prospect. And that the owners of the Spirits of St. Louis, who were a terrible team on the court and didn't make a whole lot of money. They had moved from, I think they previously were the Carolina Cougars and had done all right in that venue, but moved to St. Louis, and they ended up settling, instead of taking a chunk of money not to join the NBA to just fold up shop, they said, we want a percentage of the TV revenue you get from the NBA for the next, I think it was 25 years or something like that. And at the time, the NBA, this was before Bird and Magic, wasn't making that much out of TV. So they thought, oh, well, give them given that percentage. And the owners ended up making a mint off of that for the next 25 years because the NBA became so much more popular on TV. The Spirits of St. Louis, which was this pathetic team that lasted a couple of seasons in St. Louis, ended up being one of the most successful ABA teams to come out of that league.
I guess along those lines, in your work on Molly's biography, did you get a sense from her? I mean, we kind of probed a little bit on this about sort of perhaps why the WBL didn't take and last longer, and sort of came and went, and other attempts sort of came and went until the NBA basically helped support the launch and the continued nurturing of the current WNBA. Was there any? Did you sort of get any sense from her as to why and how the WBL kind of didn't sort of last much longer?
Well, I think there was a little bit of bad luck because the most stable franchises on the WBL were Chicago and Iowa, which is the team she played for the first 2 years. And the Iowa team was owned by the guy who invented the trampoline, interestingly enough, who made a good amount of money, and he was a really solid owner. And they drew a good amount of people to their games. But what happened was he ended up being involved in a couple of really bad investments, one of which was a movie with Pete Maravich in it that was supposed to, he sunk like $1.3 million into it, which at the time was a lot more than it is now. And he ended up getting nothing for it. It was a promotional idea that went nowhere, and it was in the theaters for maybe 2 weeks, and that was it. But then worse than that was he was involved in an investment in Iran, and he had sold the Shah of Iran $6 million worth of goods, and somehow these goods, trampolines and sporting equipment and so forth, had been delivered without payment. Well, unfortunately, the payment never arrived because that was the time when the Islamic Revolution took place in 1979, and the Shah of Iran was booted out of power, and so he never got that money. So he kind of had to fold up the Iowa Cornets, which was Molly's team for the first 2 years. And so that was one franchise, but it was one of the stronger franchises. And there was a lot of inequality in the WBL. There were a few strong franchises, but there were also some franchises like in the New York area that just didn't make it. Ann Myers played for the New Jersey team, and they would draw like 800, 900 fans to a game. And so they just couldn't continue to function with that kind of low attendance. But I think also beforehand, at that point in time, again, this was before the NBA even was that popular. So basketball itself was just on the cusp of breaking, men's basketball was, into the big time of pro sports, with the advent of Dr. J coming in from the ABA and then Bird and Magic and Showtime and the Lakers-Celtics rivalry. This was just about to happen. And so I think you flash forward 20 years to when the WNBA came about, and the NBA was this 800-pound gorilla, when at the time of the WBL, it was known well enough among sports fans, but not much beyond that. And I think had the WBL come into being at a time when people were more interested in basketball in general, it might have survived.
Yeah, it was also before, just on the cusp of cable television as well. You wonder, with a fledgling medium in cable television, which, like the Major Indoor Soccer League at the time in the early 80s, really got some oxygen because of things like the USA Cable Network. And, and some other sports, I think, got a few longer looks, say like the USFL perhaps extended their life and or got them more prestige until they kind of screwed it up, shall we say. Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating. We sort of go back in time, and in this little show, right, the further back you go, the more quote unquote nostalgic and or historical it becomes, right? It becomes more of an investigation, a bit more of a research effort. And, because there are less and less people who were original actors in those leagues and teams, right? So you have to rely on second and third party sources and data. But, there's a whole wealth of, leagues and teams, from the 60s onward where we're still blessed with a number of people who were part of the mix. And that's part of kind of what we're trying to do with the show is not only go back in time and talk about sort of the things that are possibly potentially lost to history, but also try to do a bit of an oral history with some of the direct participants as well. And to me, it's an endlessly fascinating topic. It regenerates all by itself. There's nothing that we need to do. And there's not to be any shortage of sports or challenger leagues or people behind them or in the midst of them that want to step up and take a crack at their own little 15 minutes or more of fame and fortune, quote unquote, when it comes to professional sports in this country. Last question sort of on the book is, were there any leagues or situations that just didn't make your cut that, you wouldn't have minded going deeper into, or for whatever reason you just couldn't create a narrative around that stuck out as an asterisk in your mind?
There really weren't. There were a couple of leagues earlier, maybe the very early basketball leagues that were just touched on. I always thought that the NBL, National Basketball League, was a fascinating, and I didn't really go into that very much, but it became one of the two leagues that merged to form the NBA. But there wasn't much that I didn't touch on. Going back to one of your other questions, the league that I have been most surprised hasn't succeeded probably out of this, and it's still around, but it's very peripheral. It doesn't have the visibility it used to, is the Arena Football League, because I think that's just a fascinating concept. It's fast-paced, it's indoors, it's different enough from outdoor football that it's almost its own sport. And at one point in time, it had 20 teams around the country. Now I think it's down to 4 or 5, and it's up in the Northeast. And it's really been interesting to me that hasn't taken off. They had Kurt Warner, for Pete's sake, as their star quarterback for the Iowa Barnstormers back in the late 90s, and he went on to win the Super Bowl for the St. Louis Rams. So they had that visibility, and somehow that just collapsed, and I'm not quite sure why.
Yeah, we had founder Jim Foster on for a two-parter, and if I recollect that conversation accurately, I think a bunch of it was another theme that keeps popping up as we go into all this stuff, and that's sort of the debate and the tension between central ownership versus franchise model. And Jim was, very protective of his baby very early on. And I think a lot of the demise of the league after it got going in the 80s and early 90s, I think he pretty much attributed to sort of losing the battle for the financial model to owners who wanted to go more the franchise route than his central ownership kind of structure that he started and frankly wanted to continue with, which, by the way, plays itself out in things like Major League Soccer, right, which is centrally controlled, or the upcoming Premier Lacrosse League, right, which is more of a kind of an event tour kind of thing, or a Big Three basketball kind of thing, right, where, everything is basically centrally owned. And who's to say which model is right? Because arguably, a lot of the franchise model was the approach that folks like Gary Davidson and Dennis Murphy, they were basically selling franchises, and in some respects, almost teams didn't care to whom, whether they had money or not. It's like, here, take it, or I have rights to this franchise. I don't want it. Do you want it? And everybody's sort of on a Ponzi scheme of get rich, right? So, again, endlessly fascinating.
But then you have the alliance, which was the one owner model, and they became indebted to this one guy who came in, their money guy, owner of the Carolina Hurricanes hockey league. And so when he said, "I don't want to pay any more money," the league just shut down. And so it's this all or nothing mentality. Or you have on the other side the franchises, which you have these really strong franchises in major markets or with moneyed owners, and other franchises, as in the WBL, that are operated on a wing and a prayer with people who don't have any money.
Well, look, this is great. I mean, this book is an excellent primer for those new to our little niche. I can't recommend it highly enough as a sampler and as a gateway drug, I guess, to this the disease, perhaps I call it a disease of endless fascination, at least to me, about the bold and interesting ideas that for whatever reasons come and go. Some of them full of folly, some of them just downright unlucky, and various stories in between. I guess last question, you do a lot of writing in other subjects, but and you can tell our audience, some of those topics in a second, but do you have any other sports things in you, or did this fully, as well as Molly's biography, get it out of your system?
I don't know. That's the answer is I write things that strike my interest. So if something else in sports were to strike my interest, I would certainly write about it. It hasn't happened yet, but that doesn't mean it won't. I would certainly be open to writing more sports-themed books. I never know what I'm going to write next.
And what kind of stuff are you writing otherwise besides the realm of sports that our audience might be interested in too?
Well, if you're interested in history, I've written a book called Highway 99, The History of California's Main Street. So if you are interested in highway history in California, that's one book I've written on that subject. I've written a book called Fresno Growing Up about my hometown, Fresno, California. I've also written fiction. I've got 2 parts of a planned trilogy out called The Immortality Saga, about a woman who can bring people back to life through the power of her photographic memory. I've written a book of short stories modeled after the Twilight Zone called Nightmare's Eve. And I've written a book on the origin story of dragons called The Only Dragon. And I have a book coming out probably in a couple of years. I publish some of these books myself, and I have a publisher who publishes some of the other books that I write. And so I have a book coming out in a couple of years about the history of department stores in America. And I have at least one more, probably 2 more highway books coming out in the future. So it's all over the map.
And where can we find out about all of those doings, and how can people learn more about you and all those titles, et cetera?
Well, you can always go to my Amazon page and plug in my name. It's Stephen with a PH, and my last name is Pro, V as in Victor, O-S-T, Provost, or Provo as it's pronounced. You can also go to my website, which is my name, Stephen H. Provost.com. I'm on Facebook. I'm on Twitter, but I don't go on there very often. But the best place to find my books is actually on Amazon. Some of them are available. The ones that are traditionally published are available in the bookstore. Or you can contact me directly, and if you want to buy directly from me, I can certainly do that and give you an autographed copy.
Well, that's awesome, and I will absolutely send my copy of A Whole Different League to you for signing, of course, and hopefully we'll get a few other people to kind of pick up the book for themselves. And look, as I said earlier, it's a great survey into this genre of sports history. And to me, it's endlessly fascinating. And if you need sort of that primer to kind of wet your whistle, so to speak, you can't figure out what the heck this little podcast is all about. Read Stephen's book, and you'll get a sense very early and often about how fascinating and endlessly so, at least in my mind, this little slice of sports and professionalism has a hook on at least 2 people who have just had this conversation. So, Stephen, thank you very much for making time, and more importantly, for sharing my illness, I guess, but in written form.
Well, thank you for having me on. It's been a pleasure.
All right, lots of interesting anecdotes and factoids there. Thank you to Stephen for a really interesting and surprisingly so conversation. I really honestly didn't know what I was going to get when I reached out, but oh boy, I found a kindred spirit, didn't I? Let's get some promotional stuff to you so that you can find out where you can get these books and find out more about Stephen's stuff. The 2 books in particular, although there's just a whole treasure trove of things otherwise, but the 2 that we kind of spent a lot of time on in our chat, you got to check out and add to your collection. One is called A Whole Different League, the subtitle being Outlaw Leagues, Forgotten Teams, and Other Adventures in American Sport. That is published by Dragon Crown Books. That came out earlier this year. And the other book, of course, that came out in April of this year that you should also find and add again to your library, The Legend of Molly Bolin, Women's Pro Basketball Trailblazer. That is also published by Dragon Crown Books. You can find both of those books, as well as the whole treasure trove of other books by Stephen Provost, on our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com. Just search up this episode number 116. Oh my God, 116 episodes already. And you will find links to those two books, as well as the gateway to all of Stephen's other books via our pals at Amazon. You can, find out more about Stephen generally, about all of his stuff, all of his works, his writings, where he's going to be speaking and doing book signings. He's got some really interesting stories about Route 99 in California, the history of Fresno, California, lots of really cool stuff. Amazing science fiction series. You can find his website at stephenhprovo.com. That's Stephen, Stephen, the letter H, and then Provo, which is spelled Provost.com. stephenhprovo.com. And you can also follow him on Twitter at SProWriter. S as in Sam, Pro, Pro, Writer on Twitter. And let's see, for folks who may have not heard our Molly Bolin / Molly Kazmer episode, just search up on goodseatsstillavailable.com, will you? Episode number 28. And you'll have a great time listening to what I thought was a wonderful conversation with Molly. And I'm glad that there's even a book now out about her, courtesy of Stephen. So by all means, complete your learnings that way. Why don't you? And if you're really interested in finding out more about this show, of course, again, goodseatsstillavailable.com. That's the place to go. It's the locus for everything related to the show. And, keep an eye on that space bookmark it, because we got a bunch of ideas and concepts and additions that we're, hopefully going to launch in the months to come. But, of course, you can find all of our social feeds there. It's, for example, Twitter, we're at Good Seats Still. You'll find us on Instagram at Good Seats Still Available. Of course, you'll find us on Facebook. There's a page devoted to us there. If you want to send us some email, there's a link there, but you could also send it to us directly at hello@goodseatsstillavailable.com. And let's see what else. If you want to sign up for our weekly newsletter, well, we'll go ahead and do so. Go to our website, search there, and you'll find a link there, and you can sign up, and you'll get a little bit of a head start about what we're going to be talking about in the days or hours to come for the next week. And I don't know what else, but that's all good stuff. And I appreciate all of the cards and letters, shall we say, that keep coming in. We also want to say a great thanks, as always, each and every week to our friend Jerry Payne, who puts all of our stuff together, making us sound nice and smooth at Podfly Productions. And that's the place to go if you want to figure out how to do some podcasting yourself. Well, the best place to do it and to check it out and get your sea legs, if you will, is Podfly. And they're at podfly.net. All right. Thank you so much for listening this week. I appreciate it to no end. And until next week, we are now closing this damn ticket window. So take care, everybody. Bye-bye.